Alright, so between talking about this movie when it first came out and talking about it when we did like our end of the year videos, like our top videos, our like top lists of the year and of the decade, and doing all the awards videos and all that stuff, and just any time Tarantino kind of comes up in general in other videos, you would think that I would be done talking about this movie at this point, but it turns out that I'm not, and I'm not even mad about it. Actually, on the contrary, I'm quite happy about it because I already couldn't get enough of this as it was. I can't even begin to tell you how many times this Blu-ray has been in the player, and its deleted scenes that are on it, which I knew going in from having seen, other stills or the Tim Roth credit or stuff like that, that even watching the movie over and over again and seeing the deleted scenes that are on the Blu-ray, there was still stuff that we haven't seen that exists somewhere, and this is the closest we've gotten now to a bit more of a taste of that. Like there's a point in the book where we have the scene with J. Sebring's butler, who Tim Roth apparently played in the scenes that were cut, and it's like to just know what they were. Like we still haven't even seen them yet, but just to know what they were now that they're actually in the book feels like we're slowly moving towards getting all the pieces, which is a really interesting thing to crave from a movie that's literally perfect as it is. And it's crazy to know that a movie is so perfect and then see in this book all of its missing pieces. Because that's basically what a lot of this is. Like when you do, like those, I don't know how old people are that would come across this, but when I was growing up, especially, and apparently I didn't realize it had been a thing for like decades. The whole idea of novelizations of movies coming out to coincide with their release to kind of help sell them in a way. And I would always go to, I think it was just Walmart, always had them, like weekly. And I would get, and there's still, I have maybe 40 tucked away in a cabinet over there, and I think that's only a fraction of the ones that I have. The rest are probably somewhere in somebody's house, but here we have Tarantino almost kind of bringing that back. Like, I wasn't even sure if that's something that, like, died off. It's just kind of something, like, once I got all of my collection of them kind of packed away, I almost kind of forgot about them and their existence. But to think that Tarantino almost kind of tried to bring that back in a way, because I feel like this is something he was going to do anyway. Like, he had talked about how his transition from movies was going to go into, like, novels and plays and stuff like that. And if this is the start of that, I think we'll be good as far as getting Tarantino content in one way or another for as long as he lives. Much as none of us want him to stop making movies. And I do still kind of hang on to the theory of this is obviously a novelization of a movie of his that already exists, and that he's already put to screen for the most part. But it's like, if he were to write another novel like this that hasn't been put to screen yet, I would be very surprised if it didn't, he wasn't overtaken by the urge to make that. Like, it would be, he just wouldn't be able to stay away from it. Kind of like the Hateful Eight incident, where when the script got out, he was like, "Oh well, I'm never gonna make it now." He really can't resist, and that's a good thing for us. So we'll see what happens with that. But what I was gonna go into was about the whole thing about this basically being the missing pieces, and talking about those novelizations that exist, where they really just kind of take the scripts, to my understanding, and maybe a little bit of other research, and yeah, just put the scripts into novel form, and that's how they would sell them. But here, there are quite a few scenes that are in the movie, but if I had to estimate, I would say most of this book is stuff that's not in the movie, but actually like kind of fills in the blanks that were in the movie that you couldn't even tell were in the movie to begin with. But now this paints such a full picture at this point, and it's like it's not so much that this is the movie plus that stuff. It's like there's some scenes in it that we recognize, and some scenes that we partially recognize. Like the very first scene is of course the Marvin Schwartz scene, but instead of being at the restaurant and with Cliff there, it's just Rick in Marvin's office. Is what the opening of the book is, with Cliff in the waiting room, which goes off on its own whole thing anyway. Um, and so yeah, so we get scenes we already know kind of in different ways, and then all the stuff, like so much of this is stuff that we didn't know about or haven't seen before, and that might take some getting used to if you're reading this expecting it to be the movie in book form. But I think it's something significantly more valuable than just the movie in book form. Like, it gives us so much more of the characters and everything else going on in the story, but also him just sort of like I think I also heard Tarantino say something about how, as far as writing books, like, it wasn't just novels he wants to write. He actually wants to write like sort of movie history books, which is a lot of what this is. Also, like, this is basically a classic movie and classic TV textbook while also telling his story and also having the Manson stuff in there. I love, despite how different the book is, it had everything in it that I loved about the movie, which was somehow doing that, like, Hollywood history, the story he's telling, and the Manson stuff kind of all at once, and somehow it's all working together to tell one story. And I was completely taken by the book all over again, the same way I was the first night I saw the movie. The first night I saw the movie twice in a row. Uh, but yeah, so yeah, I'm just gonna go into this, I guess. It might be all over the place, but the timeline in the book is kind of all over the place, so I guess it's fitting. We'll just talk about whatever comes up. If you, for some reason, haven't read the book, and you're like watching this now, but you want to kind of go into the book without knowing too much, I assure you this is not the place you want to be, because I'm going to go into just about anything that I can in this uh, time frame, whatever that ends up being. Um, but yeah, so like I was talking about, immediately when it sets up the fact that it's going to be something different, while kind of this, like, it's the same story for sure. It does send us in so many different directions. Like, all you have to do is look at chapter 2, where after the first chapter is Rick's meeting with Schwartz, and then obviously we talked about the fact that Cliff is just kind of hanging out in the waiting room. But then, much like what the movie does, we go into, like, we'll start with one person, and then we'll kind of follow another person into a different scene, and so on. And that's what happens here. And what I really love about this, and it kind of being a movie textbook as well as being this story with these characters, is that Tarantino uses movies to kind of build the character of who we're looking at. Like, this whole chapter that's devoted, this first chapter that's devoted to Cliff, is basically talks about how Kurosawa movies are basically how Cliff shaped his identity. And so we basically get a whole sort of Kurosawa essay, at least as far up to 69, where it's set. And there's even a place in here somewhere where, here it is, where he even stops describing these scenes and just gives us Cliff's top 5 Kurosawa movies. And obviously it's very specific. That's very specific in itself. Talking about The Bad Sleep Well being number 5 for the opening scene alone, in parentheses. um, and like the way he uses his love of movies to actually build his characters, and to be able to use the novel format for that, because obviously with novels, because if you're really into movies specifically, as a medium, when you're watching or when you're reading a book, it might almost seem like there's a lot of like, it's hard to decipher how much description is necessary depending on the story. Where you have some people that get right to it, and then you have people like, Stephen King or somebody that just describes everything. Or it's like when you read, like, The Great Gatsby or something, and it's like 90% of that book is just Fitzgerald describing, like, Gatsby's yard and shit. um, but here, to use the stuff that's already enticing, about where we're coming from, which would be a love of movies, like, you would have to have a full-on love of movies to find your way to a Tarantino book, I would think. And that just carries over so well. And like I said, that even goes into TV eventually, because it is interesting how because I'm kind of in the same boat. Like, I love Breaking Bad and Fargo and stuff like that, the Fargo series and stuff like that. But I'm very much on Tarantino's wavelength when he's doing interviews, and you see in a lot of interviews the question has been brought up to him, how do you feel about most people thinking that TV is where the really good stuff is now? And you can see such a resentment that I kind of am fully there with, because I'm obviously ride or die with movies, much as there are a few shows that I really love. Um, but that's while I'm totally in agreement with him, I also love how much into like classic TV he was, because there's just as much explanation and love for classic TV in both this book and this movie, um, as there is movies. And one of those comes through, and there's a lot of explanation of like where certain actors were coming from at a time, because the whole story is the setup of actors trying to get from TV to movies, and the ones that succeed and the ones that don't, the McQueens and the Ricks. But the thing about that is, when we get to the stuff with James Stacy gets his own chapter when he's introduced, and a lot of the book is devoted to kind of the almost like the rivalry between Rick and Stacy. But there's a whole chapter devoted to how Stacy got the lead in Lancer, and it was his two-part Gunsmoke episode, and pretty much the whole chapter for James Stacy is Tarantino just describing that Gunsmoke episode. That's all it is. And there's a couple of times where he does that in here, where he just completely describes like a movie, or a TV show. Like there's a great moment when the introduction chapter to Cliff, where he takes Schwartz's secretary to see I'm Curious Yellow, and he basically describes all of like specifically like the sex scene in that movie and how it basically revolutionized how we see sex scenes now. Like I said, we get like a whole Hollywood history of these random things that we really didn't quite know about, but we feel in such confident hands with Tarantino, because it's that case of, you hear him talk about movies and all these really obscure. He's dropping all these obscure names. He did that thing with Kimmel where he was able to identify a lot of those old VHSs by the back of their boxes. And the ones that he didn't get are because they were poorly described, like they often were. I have a million of those VHSs with those where they either didn't tell you shit, or they literally told you everything from beginning to end, like a Wikipedia summary. And how he knows all about all those things, and you hear him talk about that stuff, and you're like, I wish there was a way somehow like that knowledge of movies could be, you know, that can be put upon you, and then it's like this is basically the start of him basically teaching you. Like I know a lot of people are really like weirdly jealous now that he has a child, because it's like, imagine the film history lessons that child is going to grow up with. And it's like I want that knowledge imparted on us is the word I was looking for a minute ago. And now we're like finally getting that. Like we're actually getting Tarantino really giving us that movie knowledge that he has. And it's, like I said, it feels like an entire education while he's telling you his own story. And that's basically what he's always been doing with this whole idea, where people are like, oh, he, just steals from movies, he takes the same techniques or whatever. But that's what it is there's those touches from all those other movies, but his own original story is clearly at the forefront of everything. And that's kind of what it feels like here, where we're getting his story for sure. But like I said, it feels like we're getting educated at the same time. And what I especially love about him going really into detail about those things, like completely describing a movie story or that episode of Gunsmoke, is that he's describing that episode of Gunsmoke as if it was him writing it. So even though you can watch an episode of Gunsmoke and it's like, it's obviously going to be seem uneventful and not as thrilling compared to something Tarantino could make, or an action scene that could be made today or whatever. But the fact that he describes it like it was basically a Tarantino movie, it gives you a whole other perspective on that Gunsmoke episode, and gives it a purpose that he's describing the whole thing to us, because it's like a whole kind of almost thrilling side quest we can go into, which is what a lot of this is also. Where it's like you're not entirely sure how much of the explanations were necessary, but you're really glad they're there, and you're really glad you went down that path just for the ride, really, and just to maybe get an appreciation for something you might not have even thought to appreciate. And there's so much of that in here, and it was interesting hearing about when while he was like in the process of writing this. I remember when the headline came out that was just like Tarantino says he's doing research for his movie, like historical research. And I was curious how all he was doing that. And we get, I guess, a little hint of it right here in the dedication, where he dedicates it to his wife and son, obviously. And then it says also to all the actor old timers who told me tremendous stories about Hollywood in this period, and it's because of them that you hold this book in your hands now. Bruce Dern, David Carradine, Burt Reynolds, Robert Blake, Michael Parks, Robert Forster, and especially Kurt Russell. Notice with the exception of Blake, that's all people he's worked with, or almost worked with in Reynolds' case. But yeah, and then those people are cited throughout it. Like David Carradine's book is mentioned a couple of times as a source for a couple of things. He name drops Michael Parks at one point, and it's like when he especially mentions the actors that aren't here now, which is most of these guys. Like when he mentions Parks or David Carradine or something, or Robert Forster, I think gets brought up once. It's like this really, you can get a sense that it's like a loving tribute also. Like I think Michael Parks in particular is mentioned in the context of, I can't remember exactly, but it's like somebody comparing their talent to him, I think, at that time. And it's like stuff like that, you can just tell, it's like just even mentioning their names is such kind of a loving tribute. And then Bruce Dern, obviously Bruce Dern not only being in the movie, but there is something revealed in this book that I had no idea of, and it suddenly makes so much sense when you know. And that is that Bruce Dern was in the movie twice. We just had no idea. Like I don't recall I feel like I would have heard that, but I don't recall hearing that. I don't know if he maybe brought it up once in passing or what, but all the times I've watched the movie, it never occurred to me that Scoot McNairy playing Business Bob Gilbert is supposed to be a young Bruce Dern in the acting in the episode of Lancer. And it's like I never thought about it, but then it's like, holy shit, Scoot McNairy really does kind of look like the young Bruce Dern. Like when you go back to like the early 70s or the late 60s when he was in like the Cowboys, or Marnie might have been in there, his Hitchcock movies. And you get a sense, like, yeah, that's exactly who he was supposed to be, of course. And so there's a whole other layer to that now. They even updated the Wikipedia page of the movie, where when you click on Business Bob Gilbert's name, it just takes you to Bruce Dern's page, which is amazing. So, also talking about some of like his other influences. There's a whole chapter here devoted to when they're in Italy, when Rick and Cliff are in Italy making the spaghetti westerns and the other movies. There's a whole chapter devoted to Cliff coming across Aldo Ray, who's acting in one of the movies with Rick, and they have a whole conversation. And well, that gives you a whole sort of history on Aldo Ray and what it was like with him on sets, where it was like they had to do this whole thing where people had to keep him away from alcohol, and how that plays into Cliff and what he does here. It was also interesting in the sense that we realized that obviously Aldo Ray's name was the inspiration for Aldo Rain in Inglourious Basterds. And it's like you go into this already having the visuals because the movie already exists. So the visual in your mind when you're reading that chapter, because it's a conversation between Aldo Ray and Cliff, is a conversation between Aldo Ray and essentially Brad Pitt. And Brad Pitt having played Aldo Rain, was the name inspiration. There's something there by its like the whole scene in the book is amazing, but just that connotation as well, like having the image in your head of it being Brad Pitt that's talking to Aldo Ray when there's that Bastards connection. Isn't like there's just so many layers of why these things are so you can be so drawn to these things. Now, there's something else I want to go into that is pretty amazing. When headlines come out, they can tend to be overblown, or are just meant to, sell either the thing they're talking about or their website, whatever, just to get you to read whatever they're saying. And one headline that I saw that I obviously didn't click on because I hadn't read the book yet was, I think this was before the book even came out. If you think you know the ending of Tarantino's book, you don't. Despite the fact that we know how the movie ends. And I was curious what that meant. And it's like, so how much did he add? Like, there must be, like, we do, because we do get a sense of where Rick went after the events of the flamethrower incident, the ending of the movie, basically. But before that, the thing that really threw me off and got me really excited was there are moments in this where he kind of goes on little things to describe. Oh, and to kind of give more context to this, here's a whole story of what happened here. Like, he gives a whole story about how Cliff basically explains to Rick how to kill somebody and how to work up the nerve to kill somebody and what it's like, and then gives him this whole suggestion of, why don't you, like, bring a pig into your backyard and do all these particular things. And it's this really detailed description of what would happen if Rick killed a pig in his backyard, and that's what it would be like killing somebody. Like, the way they just kind of stop in your grasp. And it gets really detailed. And we get really kind of into Cliff's psyche in regards to how killing is basically his instinct. But before that, before we go into that, well, I guess this kind of ties into that because we're talking about the ending of the movie, which is when he goes on these tangents and says, oh, here's this past thing that happened to explain what's happening in this scene. That's what happened. That's how the climax of the movie is described in the book. The book is exactly 400 pages, and the ending of the movie is described on page 110. And if you don't mind, I want to take you through this real quick. How he describes the ending of the movie. Where it talks about he's working with Rick is working with his favorite director, Paul Wingo, who he's done a lot of movies with, who is an actual director. And then they lead into a whole thing about how Wingo just makes like a passing comment about something that happened to Rick. And then sure enough, if this sounds familiar, this is what it says. What Wincos was referring to, no sooner did Rick and his new bride arrive from Rome to his house in Benedict Canyon than 3 hippies, 2 girls and a guy, broke into his home, brandishing butcher knives and a pistol, threatening his family. Rick and Cliff made short order of the housebreakers, killing all 3 in a brutal fight. Cliff in the living room, protecting Rick's new wife Francesca, bashed in the faces of the guy and one of the girls. Rick, who was in his floaty chair in the swimming pool at the time of the attack, was almost shot by the hippie girl with the pistol. He later told authorities, that goddamn hippie almost blew my fucking head off. And in a scene straight out of Winco's picture, The 14 Fists of McCluskey, Rick set the assailant on fire with the practice flamethrower left over from McCluskey, which he had in his tool shed. I burnt that goddamn hippie to a crisp, he later told his neighbor. And then it goes on, what the armed intruders' intentions were was never made clear. But their intentions sounded both deadly and evil. When Cliff asked the male intruder what he wanted, the young man invoked Satan, saying, I'm the devil, I'm here to do the devil's business. The LAPD theorized the hippie intruders were frying on acid and were out to perform a satanic ritual. What isn't a matter of theory is those fucking hippies sure picked the wrong house. That's on page 110 and 111 of the 400-page book, and it's never mentioned again. That's the climax of the movie. That's the portion of the movie that made everybody lose their fucking minds. And he just drops it like nothing on page 110 and 111, like it's, oh, by the way, this thing happened. and it didn't even go into, I don't think, Tex is mentioned by name like once when we go through the Spawn Ranch scene, but even that's different. Because we get the Spawn Ranch scene through the perspective of Squeaky. While she's sitting in the living room waiting for Cliff to come up, and then when Cliff goes in to talk to George, we still only hear it from her perspective, and when, like, the Clem beating isn't even there. So that whole thing is just a side note of, oh, by the way, that's a thing that happened, we don't know why. And so that begs the question, how the hell does the book end? That's the question I was asking for nearly 300 pages of a movie that I've seen like 15 times, at least. I was like, what the hell's the ending? And I do want to get to that eventually, but going back to the idea that Cliff kills so easily, which was something that was kind of left up in the air a lot in the movie. Another thing that people might not be sure about going into the book is stuff like that. The ambiguity that's in the movie being fully explained to where there's no mystery whatsoever. Because obviously, one of the fun things about Cliff's character in the movie was never knowing for sure if he killed his wife. Um, and the book is not shy at all about telling you exactly how many people Cliff has killed. I mean, as far as him being in World War II, which I was a little confused by because I remember Tarantino saying he was in the Korean War when the movie was coming out, but still, um, but yeah, he's a World War II veteran, and then this whole thing about how he killed like countless people. But then once he came back, we kind of get a bit of a history on all the people he's killed, and sometimes they get kind of their own moments, and we're not quite sure that that's what it's leading to. Like um, when we get Brandy's whole backstory of how he got her, and how that ended up leading to him having to kill somebody. And it's like, and he says that was the second time Cliff killed somebody. So it always kind of leaves you kind of wanting that thing. And then eventually, when we get the story of the first time that he killed somebody post war, it almost kind of sneaks up on us. Like the point in time, the way that scene builds up, where he's with like a gangster's girlfriend, um, or a kind of a low level gangster's girlfriend, and then he gets approached by these two dudes, and you think it's just gonna, the way it's set up, and especially since they're in a public place, you think it's gonna be like a fight breaks out, and he like just kind of pulverizes them, but yeah, it eventually leads to the point where it's like, and that's the first time Cliff killed somebody post war. um, and then there's the whole Bruce Lee scene where it talks about obviously, so this has come up in so many different ways since the movie came out, but the thing about it being, a lot of people were pissed off how Tarantino made Cliff look a lot tougher and smarter than Bruce Lee and stuff like that, and how Bruce Lee looked like an asshole that couldn't fight Cliff or whatever. Um, but this goes into such an interesting thing about how, knowing the fact that Cliff is like a trained killer before any of this even happened. Like before he came back out post-war, he has now been basically trained to kill, and he's been there and killed God knows how many people. So the whole idea is that when he's fighting Bruce Lee, it's like the reason Cliff kills people so easily, as we saw in the climax of the movie, is that it's basically just an instinct to him. Like, so it's like when he's fighting, the actual phrasing I believe in the book is, Cliff isn't fighting Bruce Lee, he's fighting his instinct to kill Bruce Lee. So it's really just him kind of fighting himself and holding himself back, while trying to have a fair fight. And it's and then it goes into his whole process of how he decipher, hustling Lee and getting him to use the same move so that he could hurl him into the car. And that's another thing, like the way he really picks and chooses what was in the movie and what was in the book. The whole thing about it being Zoe Bell's car is not even mentioned in the book, and Randy's barely mentioned in the book. It just talks about how he was sort of blackballed after the incident, and that's really about it. Like I said, there's a lot of stuff in the book that you might love in the movie that's missing, but like I said, it's like he really went all in on the idea that they're two totally different mediums, so even though they're telling the same story, they can have two totally different feels. And that kind of goes into also how the endings are different, and how, because the ending of the novel feels like a very appropriate ending to the novel, and knowing the way Tarantino makes movies, the ending of the movie feels extremely appropriate for the way a Tarantino movie would end. But with a novel, you kind of get to be a bit more downplayed, I guess. Like, those people that kind of prefer Jackie Brown when they look at Tarantino's filmography, which of course Jackie Brown is a masterpiece in itself, for sure. I believe he also said, I think it was in his Ben Mankiewicz interview, Tarantino said that if somebody were to tell him that Jackie Brown was their favorite of his movies, he assumes you don't like his movie. He's like, you're not a fan of his, if Jackie Brown's your favorite of his. Um, but the thing, but for the people that liked that Jackie Brown was kind of more of a downplayed thing and wasn't as, theatrical about itself the way a lot of his others are, like the Tarantino fashion that we as his devoted fans love him for, and we anticipate, um, that's not like Jackie Brown is still him, up and down, left and right, sideways and diagonal, for sure. But as far as like the bigness and the theatricality of it, isn't near as present as it is in his other movies. And it's like if that's the kind of Tarantino you like, um, you might be much more into the book than you are the movie. Because like I said, the big theatrical stuff that's in the movie is so nonchalantly handled in the book. And it's a lot more about like sort of Rick's quest, where it's like I guess to talk about why the ending is so satisfying the way it is would be to also talk about something that I was kind of jarred by the fact that it was missing from the book, because it's one of my favorite scenes in the movie, which is after the. I guess it's worth setting up that because we nonchalantly talk about what happened in August. And we kind of talk about from there, Rick went on to have a career in the 70s, but it was probably not as big as he'd hoped, but it was steady enough. But the idea that the whole thing is Rick feels alienated. And, like, McQueen's off doing his thing. McQueen's off getting the parts that he wanted. There's a whole thing where after shooting, because, like I said, we'll go one at a time here, because there's so much. A scene that I really, really love in the movie so much, it's actually two scenes back to back. It's when Rick has finished shooting Lancer for the day, Cliff has finished his run-in at Spawn Ranch, and Sharon's leaving the theater. And so, like, everything is winding down, the sun's going down, that beautiful rendition of California Dreamin' is playing, is like, everything is settling into the night. And Stacy's going his way, and Rick and Cliff are going home. And when they get there, they watch FBI. And it's like those two scenes back to back. Everybody going home, and them watching FBI is just a perfect stretch of movie. Like, so incredibly perfect. And the book has something else up its sleeve. Because, while everything is, like, he played the scene perfectly, and Trudy gave him that compliment that, like, completely, like, reinvigorated him. And probably watching himself on FBI probably reinvigorated him at the same time, and then he just happened to get the call from Schwartz right after that. So it was, like, this perfect aligning of things. The book's approach is, he's still got another day of Lancer, and that's what he's really laser-focused on. So instead of the relaxation and all that, it's, okay, now that we've done this for the day, I've got to get home and really learn my lines so I can really do this even better tomorrow. And that's what ends up being the focus. And so because of that, the rest of the book is basically set in, because the movie had those 2 days in February and then the fateful day in August. Apart from the detours to tell us what eventually happened, the story in the book stays in February. So we kind of finish on that night, the night where he's got another day of Lancer the next morning. And so the way we play on that, and instead of him and Stacy going their separate ways, they go into a bar, the three of them, and everybody that's there, and there's this whole thing with that. And then we kind of see like where Rick's coming from, particularly with his resentment towards losing The Great Escape to McQueen, but not really, because he was so far down on the list. And there's this amazing thing, I would have done anything to hear DiCaprio deliver, where he goes through the whole thing of how he wasn't even close to play McQueen's part in The Great Escape when you look at who was on the list. And he goes through the whole idea of, the whole scenarios of, this would have to happen to this actor, and this would happen to this actor, and this actor, and it's a whole thing. And then he said, and maybe if all of that unrealistic shit happened, then I would have maybe gotten the part. But even then, I still would have probably lost it to somebody else. And it's so, like, I want so badly to have actually seen that scene on screen. But then again, we would have had to sacrifice the going home montage and the FBI scene. And I love that because the novel exists, we get both. I'm so grateful. Like it's like that's the thing. It's like you read this novel and you're like, what's one thing you want to say to Tarantino right now? I just want to say thank you. That's that's all. They give us all these. Just give us this. Just spoil us with riches. Um, but anyway, the point I was getting at in regards to this bar scene um, is that this whole idea that Rick feels alienated and like he's getting farther and farther away from kind of being in the in crowd of this. And so the most satisfying ending we can have that we get is when he's running his lines with Trudy over the phone. These scenes that we've seen so many pictures of that we never quite knew the context of at the time, and this picture of McQueen comes into play as well because they're like back-to-back scenes at the end of the book. And it's like he has this really great moment where Sharon decides that she wants to throw a party at the last minute. So she and Polanski are doing that, and McQueen shows up for that party. And of course, Rick is standing outside with his alcohol and his robe uninvited because he's kind of out of the crowd. But that scene right here, pictured, is him stopping McQueen, I'm assuming. Him stopping McQueen, and they kind of have this nice conversation. And then right after that, Trudy calls him, and they go over their lines, and we get to know what the end of the Lancer episode was and how it went, which is something I always wanted to know, which is great. I kind of wish he had written it out because he wrote the first Lancer scene, the first couple of Lancer scenes, the same way he did it in the movie, where it was like we were basically watching the show. It's like when the Lancer scenes happen here, the scenes that they're playing happen here. We're basically reading a book. Like, we're reading the Lancer episode in book form, just like the movie did it. And I was kind of hoping we'd get the ending of it that way, but I really love the way, like, that's what I wanted at the time, but now that I see what he's done, it's perfect the way it is. Where we basically get the ending of the Lancer episode as, I guess you could say it's the climax of the book, but it's him and Trudy running lines together over the phone, but it has just the same amount of impact. But there's also something so poignant here because with this following the McQueen scene, we talked about how the end of the movie ends on an optimistic note as far as Rick's career goes, because it's like, you know, now that that's happened and now that he's met Sharon and that he's at Polanski's house, people kind of leave the movie assuming that probably means he'll get a part in a Polanski movie like he wanted at like he was talking about at the beginning, and like how that's the one thing that could really reinvigorate him because Rosemary's Baby had just happened. And while the book doesn't go into that ever happening, it ends between his relationship with Trudy being so strong and the fact that she went on to get nominated for 3 Oscars, including a Tarantino movie, because he had to name and drop himself at some point. And two of the parts in there are already pre-existing parts that people, or one, at least one was nominated for, I think, and then the other one is this fictional movie from 1999 that Tarantino directed with based on like a John Sayles script. And it's the fact that they kind of stayed in touch that whole time. And with that and the McQueen scene, it's like the book ends with Rick building bridges, which was basically the task to begin with. And it's like, it doesn't matter necessarily if he still eventually, you know, wound up in obscurity or whatever, but the fact that he was able to keep it going for as long as he could and have those relationships and not feel like an outcast entirely. And just the way the book just kind of almost, I would say almost abruptly ends on that note. But after I read the very last sentence and I closed the book, there was like 30 seconds where I just had to stop and be like, you know, that's an interesting place to just kind of end. Like I said, it almost feels kind of abrupt. And then just in that 30 seconds, it was like kind of setting in, and it's like, oh wow, I can't imagine a more perfect ending. Like the way you kind of take in everything and how it fits together and what it says about what we already know about Rick and what Rick has been through. Suddenly, it feels extremely sort of cathartic, in a way. And like I said, in a much more downplayed way than obviously the ending of the movie is, which, like I said, if that's more of your thing, I said, and it feels more appropriate for a novel, it just makes so much sense. And I just felt so incredibly satisfied. And yeah, so that's where the ending goes. I wrote some stuff down here because I didn't want to miss anything, just some random details, but I think that's kind of the main stuff, the stuff we've touched on. Oh yeah, here's something I wanted to go into. Um, about Tarantino playing with history and how usually it's the big things like how the bastards killed Hitler and how um, Rick killed or Rick killed Sadie and Cliff killed Katie and Tex and all them, preventing the murders of Sharon Tate and J.C. Ring and their friends. Um, but there's some more altering history throughout this book, where it's kind of like a butterfly effect sort of thing, like a ripple effect. Where this was also stuff where I was like learning stuff that I didn't know. Where it talks about Rick being in a movie with George Papard called Cannon for Cordoba, and what's interesting about that, and it talks about how it was with that director, and how it talks about the character that Rick played. Now he was like the villain, I think. Um, and this was a movie that I had never heard of. So when I was reading the book, I assumed I could never quite tell, is this a fictional movie within the story or is it a real movie? And I looked it up, and it is a real movie. But going further on that, um, it talks about how once Rick made that movie, George Papard offered him a guest spot on his show Banachek at the time. And the thing about it is, I looked it up and found out that that was a real show, which I didn't know about. And then I thought about it, and it's like, oh, wait a minute. So I looked up Cannon for Cordova, and the part that it says Rick played was played by an actor named Don Gordon. And I looked up Don Gordon, who I'd never heard of, and sure enough, like 4 years later, after Cannon for Cordova, Don Gordon had a guest spot on Banachek. So, like, Rick kind of went down Don Gordon's path entirely, and I guess Don Gordon has another. I guess you could say he got the shit end of the stick in this deal, but we can assume in this universe Don Gordon went down a different path entirely. And just details like that are so fun, and like I said, especially since they make you look up this other stuff that you've never heard of, and sends you down all these other rabbit holes. And it's like now I want to see other stuff that Don Gordon. I'm pretty sure I've seen stuff that Don Gordon was in. But to like really like take note of him now and know like all those times you hear Tarantino talk about these old movies, and he'll just rattle off all the supporting actors in them whose names are otherwise never remembered. And it's like when you've always kind of wanted that knowledge, like you envy that knowledge and you want to be able to retain all of it the way he does. And it's like this is a really good start. You have a textbook now, basically, for a lot of them. So I'm gonna probably revisit this a lot based on that alone, let alone revisiting the story itself, which is perfect as well. Um, then I was talking about how we get the scenes that we know about that aren't on the Blu-ray for some reason, like the Tim Roth scene. There's also this very mysterious scene on the cover where Sharon is at Jay's salon, which is a picture I feel like I've seen a million times. And I believe there was even like shots from the set of them at the salon, and there's still like no no telling what this scene was. We get a tiny glimpse of what it probably was in this, where it talks about how Sharon is mad at Roman for most of the day because he scheduled them to do Hugh Hefner's talk show, which is a clip you can actually find on YouTube. Like I said, I did so much research while reading this. And that's the way is you being able to use like real life history to really set the scene for this story is like so incredibly fun in a way most novels don't get to be. But it talks about how she went to the salon to get ready because she had to look her best put on her TV face for this TV show with Hugh Hefner, and that she was complaining about that. And it says she was complaining about that while she was at the salon getting ready for this. And it's like, I'm assuming that's the only context we're given of Sharon at the salon, so I'm guessing that's what that scene would have been. Like I said, that going into the whole her having to prepare to do that show is like a whole other thing we're not branching off onto. Because that's the thing is because I love the relaxation of everybody going home in the movie with Rick leaving the set, Cliff Spawn Ranch, Sharon the theater. But it's like none of them in the book get to relax because Rick's got to learn his lines and Sharon has got to get ready to go do this show that she really really doesn't want to do. So they throw a party instead. but like I said, the way both of those things can be equally satisfying in the different paths, either the movie sends it down or the book sends it down. Um, I'm just so enthusiastic about everything that's here. Um, well, one thing I didn't mention about the past with Cliff and who all he's killed. Yeah, no mystery whatsoever about whether or not to kill his wife. He totally 100% killed her. And in a very, very over the top Tarantino way. Um, but in a scene that doesn't really have a typical context for when Tarantino scenes just blast in violence and bloodshed and insides. To the point that I was like, this is, even for Tarantino, this is super over the top what happens to Cliff's wife. But I think that's the thing also, is being able to have um, the tool of the novel to be able to do things and describe things and tell stories that probably aren't filmable. So that's kind of the leeway I give as far as like how over the top this scene with Billy goes. Like it's by far the only thing in the book that made me say, well, that's a lot. I'm not quite entirely sure how that fits tonally, but it's, you know, where as far as tones go, obviously this is a movie that really has a number of them, but I love the balance of them anyway. I said that Tarantino fashion where you're just kind of waiting for shit to get really big and out of control. Just happens sporadically throughout the book, but by no means ends that way. It ends on that very, you know, cathartic and poignant note that just really, like I said, you almost need to have to take a second to like even let it just kind of set in. And once that happened, you realize just how incredibly satisfying it all is. And like I said, it's not just a novelization of the movie. It's really a companion of the movie. Like you can watch the movie and then read the book, or the other way around, and be told the same story but have two completely different experiences to bring on two completely different kind of emotions, and just kind of the feel of it or whatever. And the fact that he was able to find, but like the fact that there is a difference between the way he makes a movie and the way he writes a book, makes it really exciting to see him go down this book path more. So yeah, I think the only other thing that I wrote down that I didn't mention was I liked a bit of a callback, and I don't know if this was exactly the intent, but I like to think it's him sort of resurrecting something he didn't get the chance to use. Um, there's a really great introduction to Sharon that's its own chapter, where we're not quite sure at first who we're looking at because the character names aren't being dropped. Um, but it's a hitchhiking woman being picked up by a guy from Texas, um, and being taken to where she wants to go. And then it's slowly revealed that this is Sharon on her way to Hollywood, for the first time. And it's eventually name dropped in a really nice way that this driver that picked her up's name is Ace Woody. And if you remember, going way back to when Django was in production, there was a character that was supposed to be in Django called Ace Woody that was going to be Costner, and then it was going to be Kurt Russell, and when both of them had to drop out, the character was just meshed into Billy Crash, the Walton Goggins character. So Ace Woody no longer existed in the Tarantino universe after that. And now somebody with that name does. So that's very satisfying. And that it's somebody as crucial as the guy that gave Sharon Tate a ride to Hollywood, where she started to take off, is, yeah. So that might be just about everything, I think, that I need to touch on. So that, I mean, I figured it'd be fun to read a novelization of Once Upon a Time. I didn't realize it was going to basically be a whole other side of the story that we already knew, and give us a whole bunch of other stuff. A whole bunch of stuff that we can understand why it would be unfilmable, but also stuff that we would love to see. And stuff that we know exists on film somewhere. Certainly not all of it. But like, you know, the Tim Roth scene or the salon scene. And it's like, I'm sure all these scenes have worth. And there's there's a moment in the deleted scenes where there's just kind of a long take where the camera's just kind of sitting there, and it's Rick and Sam Wanamaker sitting in their director's chairs just kind of talking about the scene, and that's in here as well. And I said that whole rivalry between him and Stacy that goes kind of unspoken is hilarious. I didn't even talk about how obviously the book is just as funny as the movie as well, with so many different things in there that, like I said, aren't even touched on in the movie. And it's like I said, it almost feels like I was afraid it almost make the movie feel almost small by comparison, like the movie's missing a lot. But I think the movie still is just so perfect as it is. And like I said, just this basically kind of being its own separate thing, but it all kind of being one story. Like I said, sometimes it goes in different directions, and there's some things that happen in the movie that apparently don't happen within the story of the book at all because something else happens instead. But no, neither one takes away from the other. So how much more satisfying can you possibly be? And for a movie that's just so a movie that you really just can't get enough, or at least I can't get enough of anyway. I know a few people that kind of watch it like on repeat the way that I did, and I still just find it like it's one of those like if all else fails kind of movies. Like if I just feel like watching something or just having something on, but I don't know what, it never fails. It's always like yeah that'll do. And then I always say I'm just gonna put it on for background noise or something or just to have something on, and I'm just always end up laser focused on it all over again. Like this, it just puts me in a trance I can't explain, and I love that this movie exists. I love that this book exists. I love that this story exists. I love that Tarantino exists. I'm just these are the things that make me happy right now. When there's not much in the world that's gonna make you happy, thank God we have this stuff. So yeah. So I guess I'm going to leave that at that. I'm gonna do a Nicolas Cage video next, where I'm basically catching up on all the stuff that he's done that I haven't talked about yet, and then Pig will be on that video as well. So that'll be fun. And then I'm gonna talk about Midnight Run just because I want to, and then Jungle Cruise, and then that should be it for July from me. So, and then we'll see when August is when stuff is going to start pouring out. So that'll be fun and exciting, hopefully. But yeah, this kind of nothing for the rest of this year is going to be as satisfying as partaking in this book. But that's what happens when Tarantino gets involved. It's like everything else is just subpar by comparison, even if it's great in itself. But yeah. So until that other stuff, I think that's it.